And we are back. We are going to pick up where we left off. We didn't quite get through chapter 12.1 yesterday, so we're going to start this session with the end of chapter 12.1, and then we're going to do all of chapter 12.2. But we've condensed everything. We're going to make it enjoyable for you, hopefully. These are the pages that you'll want to follow along with, too, in your book. It's 398 to 407. There's our guy for this unit. There's Andrew Jackson. Let's get after it. All right, so our learning objectives for today. I will be able to explain how economic issues led to the increased sectional tension, and I will describe the impact of the Indian Removal Act on Native Americans. So to review from the last couple days, one, sectionalism has continued at this point to be a force in America. Remember what sectionalism is. That's regional focus or regional interests in government and politics and policy. Two, Andrew Jackson was defeated in the election of 1824. You went through those slides and watched that video yesterday. He believed that he was the victim of a corrupt bargain. States began loosening requirements for voting in the 1820s. Land ownership was no longer needed to be able to vote. Remember, that was one of the conditions you needed to meet before you were eligible to vote. You had to own land. That was no longer the case. Many more men became eligible to vote because of this. And then Andrew Jackson beats JQ, that's John Quincy Adams, in the election of 1828 after a very, very nasty campaign. All right, so let's look at Andrew Jackson's presidency. So the spoils system. I'm guessing that some of you have heard this phrase before. To the victor go the spoils, or to the victor belong the spoils. Andrew Jackson applied that to his staffing and his hiring of all kinds of government offices. So during his campaign, Andrew Jackson promised to reform the government. So he began by replacing many government officials with his own personal allies. This became the spoils system. So this quote is directly tied to this idea of the spoils system. Basically, what it means is that Andrew Jackson won the presidency, and now he could recreate, or he could put together his own government in any way that he saw fit, just because he won, and that's what he gets. That's what you get to do when you win. So, all right, sectional differences continue. So remember that the three main sections of America that we've talked about so far at the time of the presidency of Andrew Jackson were the Northeast. We're talking about like New York and New England, that area, the South, and the West. So these three regions or sections, remember that's where we get the word sectional, they clashed over government policy. So there are three main issues that cause conflict between these sections. So rising tariffs, that was a major one. The sale of public lands in the West was another, and then federal spending on roads and canals. We're going to pay a lot of attention right now to the issue of rising tariffs. So what was the problem? Well, tariffs were a big problem. So the economy of the Northeast, remember we're talking about New England and New York, it was based on manufacturing and factories. A tariff made sense for the Northeast. Well, remember what a tariff does? It's a tax on imported goods. So basically, an additional charge on things you would import from countries like maybe France or Holland or Britain, things like that. So it raised the prices of goods imported from other countries. So this would have the effect that it would make people more likely to buy less expensive goods that are made in America. Well, you always want to, look for a value. You're not going to overspend on things when you could get something maybe a little bit cheaper. So that would be good because people would be paying less for goods and materials, but it was also protect American industry and American workers. See, they're going to have less competition from foreign entities because of the tariff. People are going to steer themselves towards purchasing things that are made in America. Oops, that was a mistake. All right, but what about other sections of the country? We know that tariffs are going to be very, very beneficial or helpful or good for the Northeast, but other sections didn't have that same opinion, okay? Especially the South. Well, why didn't the South like the tariffs? Well, because the South is a plantation-based economy without factories. They're not going to get the benefit of the tariffs because they don't have those factories there that are manufacturing goods that compete against goods that are brought in from other countries. So all tariffs would do for the South was raise the prices on goods that they purchased. So can you see here how different sections of the country were in conflict with one another over the issue of tariffs? The South did not like it at all. All right, so this is a map from your book. I just want to show you again. These are the sectional interests that existed in the country at the time. Here you go. You have the Northeast. Here's a factory that we just talked about, a manufacturing facility. Here's the South. They oppose the rising tariffs, and here are the issues out in the West. You see, look, a cowboy or something right there. All right, federal government versus the states. So this whole issue of the tariff shed light upon the issue of states' rights. This is going to be a major, major important term that we're going to be using going forward between now and the rest of the year. So should a federal tariff be allowed if it has a negative impact on a certain state or region? That was a debate at the time. So if you lived in the South and the tariff hurt you financially, you might think that your state had a right to ignore the tariff. Just forget it. We're not going to deal with this tariff because it's hurting us. And a lot of people in the South felt that way. Some of you may know this is the state flag of South Carolina, a very unique flag. That is the palmetto tree and a crescent moon behind it. I always thought that was a cool flag. All right, so all this stuff over the tariffs is going to lead to something called the Nullification Crisis. This guy over here is John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun, for Andrew Jackson's first term as president, serves as his vice president. He was also the vice president under John Quincy Adams right before Andrew Jackson, too. And yes, if you're wondering, I am extremely jealous of his hair. Not so much the beard, but definitely the hair up here. All right. In 1828, Congress passed a bill that increased tariffs on raw and manufactured goods. So this is what we were talking about before. The South gets really, really upset by this. Some in South Carolina even talked about the state leaving the Union, means quitting the United States. When we talk about union, we mean the Union of States, the United States. They would quit. They would cease to be part of the United States. So John C. Calhoun, this guy over here, declared that any state could nullify, which means to reject, any federal law that it considered unconstitutional. This was called the doctrine of nullification. So that means that South Carolina, because of this tariff, they can decide that, well, we're just going to reject this thing because it's unconstitutional and it's really, really hurting people in our state and, in a broader sense, the entire section or region of the South. Well, Congress reduced the tariffs, but South Carolina was still not satisfied. A bunch of leaders in South Carolina even threatened to secede. That's another word we're going to be talking about a lot in the coming weeks. That means to withdraw from the Union or leave the United States. So, what was Jackson's policy toward Native Americans? Well, Native Americans are going to be forced west at this time. So when Jackson took office, many Native Americans still lived east of the Mississippi River when Andrew Jackson took office. White settlers wanted to move into areas that were, at the time, inhabited by Native American tribes as Native Americans continued their movement into the West. So this pressure for tribes to move to the West, to give up their lands to white settlers, is only going to increase during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. Many whites, in turn, saw Native Americans as just an obstacle or a hindrance or a block to their progress and expansion. So what could be done about the situation? Well, some people wanted Native Americans to assimilate or join white culture. So if any of you were in Miss H's class in 7th grade for social studies, I know you talked about assimilation with her a lot in your studies of different cultures. Other people, other white settlers, just wanted Native Americans to be moved further west. They didn't care if they assimilated in the culture, they just wanted them out. So when Jackson took office, nearly 100,000 Native Americans remained east of the Mississippi River. So I put this map here behind the text to show you what areas we're talking about. So this is the Mississippi River. I'm going to trace it right now with my little pointer on the screen. So we go past, hey, there's St. Louis. It's good baseball right there. Oh, now we're going down. Cairo, Illinois. Oh, Paducah, Kentucky, I think. Down to like Memphis. And there's Vicksburg. And out New Orleans. All right. So this is the Mississippi River. So this area east was still inhabited by 100,000 or so Native Americans. The white settlers and a lot of people down in the South especially wanted them moved over here to the west side of the Mississippi River, across the west bank of the Mississippi River. So here's what happened. Here's Jackson's removal policy. Jackson had been a supporter of relocating tribes at least as early as the War of 1812. He had to deal with it in the southeastern part of the country back in those days. He viewed Native Americans as conquered people, and his opinion was they could either assimilate, which means, again, to adopt culture, and they could follow the laws of the states and federal government and pursue like an American way of life. But if they didn't do that, he felt that they could be moved west into the territories and they shouldn't have too much to say. in opposition to that. So Jackson asks Congress to pass a law requiring, meaning forcing Native Americans to either move west or submit to state laws. And Congress does that in 1830 with the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The act called for negotiated treaties that would force Native Americans to move west. All right, so these treaties were not honored by white Americans who signed it. So Andrew Jackson says, in his opinion, that this policy, the Indian Removal Act, was just and liberal, meaning it was fair. But it turned out that if you were a Native American being forced from your home, that policy was anything but fair and liberal. All right. The forced removal of the tribes from the southeastern United States led to disease, death, hunger, and other hardships for Native Americans. So I put this map in here. You can see the paths and the routes that a lot of these tribes from the southeastern United States took on their way out to what we will learn is called Indian Territory. So white settlers flooded Native American lands, and treaties were signed by several tribes. Okay, so what's the gist of these treaties that we're talking about? Well, Native Americans would give up their land east of the Mississippi River in exchange for lands in Indian Territory. So Indian Territory includes what we now know as Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So this area right here. There was a lot of trickery that went on too that we should talk about. So one of the tricks that that the Americans did to the Native Americans here when they moved them out there is instead of exchanging these giant tribal parcels of land for giant tribal parcels of land over here, one thing that happened was instead of just giving the tribes land, they would break it up into individual plots or parcels of land for individual people within these tribes, which made it easier later on for white people to come in and try to pick off one at a time these plots of land and just buy little pieces off one at a time from these tribes once they're over across the Mississippi River. Not fair. Or they would just ignore them outright, and they would move these tribes further west, and then when the land that they then occupied west of the Mississippi became desirable for America would just move in there and then continue forcing movements further and further west. So this is a picture of the map from your book right here. You can see it's a little bit closer up from the previous slide. So you see all of them moving west every time. So we have the Cherokee here. This was the Trail of Tears. We're going to get to that in the next slide. But this is where the Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes all ended up out here in Indian Territory, which is now, looks like right there, that looks like Oklahoma. All right, so the Cherokee people suffered terribly during this time. The Cherokee Nation actually appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States to prevent the state of Georgia from seizing or taking their land. The Supreme Court actually did side with the Cherokee, but Andrew Jackson, as Jackson does, he ignored the Supreme Court and continued the forced removal. In fact, he had a famous quote there. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court was John Marshall, and Jackson said something to the effect of, "Oh, Marshall made his decision, let's see him enforce it." So he just completely disregarded what the Supreme Court said. So a small group of Cherokee signed a treaty, and that meant, and they did not even have the support of the rest of the tribe, but this small little faction of the Cherokee signed a treaty with the United States, and because of that treaty, the entire Cherokee Nation was moved west. They were marched with very little food and only the clothes they had on their backs, and the suffering was incredible, and many died on the way to Indian Territory. Some people say up to a quarter of the Cherokee people died along the way. So this harsh and tragic forced migration of the Cherokee people is remembered as the Trail of Tears. I have linked a 3-minute video from Discovery that I would like you to watch right there. Please be safe and healthy. I will see you soon.